Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Talk Kashrus, presented by the Kashrus Awareness Project in conjunction with Torah Anytime. Today I am privileged to be joined by Rabbi Shalom Tendler, Kashrus Administrator at the Star K. Thank you, Rabbi Tendler, for being here once again.
Pleasure, thank you.
Today I'd like to discuss a very important topic, and that is the halachas of Yoshon, or Chadash as some people know it. It's in some parts of the world, it's a Dairaisa. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, we know that the Paiskim debate the matter, but many people, especially over the years, have taken on Yoshon, and they're careful to adhere to whatever restrictions there are. And I know that there's been great developments over the last few years, and the Star K is very involved as well in enabling people to keep Yoshon and Chadash properly. And even before I ask you a question, I want to give a proper shout out and a proper appreciation to Rabbi Yosef Herman, Zichronu Livracha, of the Guide of Chadash, who for years and years was kind of a one-man powerhouse behind this mitzvah, and enabled so many people to keep her properly. I think back to years when Yoshon was not so popular,
Right.
And before packages had a Yoshon stamp on them, and my parents were makpid on it, and they used that guide religiously. So definitely where we are today is great credit to his contribution to this matter. And before we do discuss it, I just think that's appropriate.
There's no question, he single-handedly brought keeping the mitzvah of Yoshon to the forefront in Chutz La'aretz, like literally single-handedly for 40 years or something like that.
Sure, a long time.
Definitely.
Pre-technology,
Right.
And I could only try to imagine what he had to do to come up with all the codes and information that he needed to put out the guide 20, 30 years ago,
Sure.
pre our current technological age. It's really incredible. When you think about it, it should be a schus for him and his family. But bring us up to date on what's happened over the last period as far as awareness. And, actually, before that, for those viewers who may not be so familiar, tell us what the laws of Yoshon and Chadash are and what products they impact and things like that. It's a big inyan, but a small summary.
Sure. So first, there's nothing new in Yoshon, right? That's always the pun, that the classic pun, almost cliche already, that everyone's using when they're talking about Yoshon and Chadash. That is nothing new. What's new? Okay, fine. I've heard that a million times already. Okay. And Yoshon is only relevant to the 5 grains: chamesh, minei dagan, wheat, oats, barley, rye, and spelt. Anyways, so the idea is basically behind Yoshon and Chadash is the following thing: is that wheat is generally harvested Chag HaKotzar. We know Shavuos time in the summer. That's when wheat, like any other crop or grain, is harvested. So the halacha is the Torah. It's pasuk in the Torah, right? That says that the new crop is not allowed to be eaten until after Pesach, which means the product that was harvested this past summer, a couple of months ago, is not allowed to be eaten until after Pesach, which is Habolein L'Toiva, in a couple of months. So that's as far as what Chadash is. That is that the new crop that's harvested in the summer is not allowed to be eaten until after Pesach comes. Yoshon is last year's crop that already passed through last year's Pesach, already passed over Pesach, right? That's another one of the puns that everybody gives, right? Already passed through Pesach, is now allowed to be eaten. And that's what's called Yoshon, the old crop. It's not stale, it's not old bread or anything like that. It could be just as fresh, as the Chadash crop is. There's nothing to do with it. It's just wheat or flour that was already harvested last summer, as opposed to 2 summers ago, as opposed to this past summer. So that's Chadash and that's Yoshon, right? So it's a pasuk in the Torah. How do we get around that? So first of all, in Eretz Yisrael, there's not much getting around that, where it's Daraisa, maybe nowadays where it's not Rov Yisrael Ad Masan. Fine, different story, but it's for sure, Karv Daraisa in Eretz Yisrael, and there's no shortcuts taken for that. Any product in Eretz Yisrael, if it's kosher, it's Yoshon.
Right.
Nothing to talk about.
Meaning part of the certification, to clarify, part of the certification of any reliable agency in Eretz Yisrael is to make sure that their products are
100%.
certified Yoshon.
Yeah, the Rabbanut is even makpid anything being imported into the country is Yoshon.
Really?
That's how far it goes. But in Eretz Yisrael, Yoshon is as aleph-based to kosher as Galat kosher is in America. There's nothing to talk about. Right? Outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's no question that it's not Daraisa. Maybe it's a Safek Daraisa, different Shitas and Rishonim. Obviously, a lot of Geshmak Torah and Rishad Gimel about that. But the predominant midig in Klal Yisrael always was over the Dairis, not necessarily to be makpid on it. And that's for 2 primary reasons. Number one is that people shouldn't have food. Right. So if you're going to start limiting the availability of such a basic thing as flour, right? You can't get more basic than that. They had to go with whatever shitas are lahakal. So therefore, they ended up going with shitas lahakal as far as it only being derabanan in chutz la'aretz, maybe not applying in chutz la'aretz. And then the big one, which is that the way the Rosh says it, and the Ramah brings it as far as being a svek sveka. You don't really know what's new crop, what's old crop. And therefore, there's plenty of grounds lahakal, and that's pretty much how Klal Yisrael lived for hundreds, not thousands of years. That it's not something that in chutz la'aretz they were necessarily yechidim, but Klal Yisrael in general was not makpid on this, until relatively recently. So what changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years or something like that, and really what prompted Rabbi Herman, Zechron Livracha, to start this campaign. So honestly, I don't know what prompted him to start it 40 years ago, right? But the reality was that there's something that changed in the United States of America that kind of switched the dynamic of Yoshon. I don't know exactly what year it was, but what happened was the following thing, is that it became very public information. The United States has a tremendous amount of wheat crop, and what they would do is that they would have years and years of warehouses of wheat,
like a surplus,
surpluses of wheat available. And therefore, the Svek was alive and well, and no one really knew what was Chadash, what was Yoshon, and therefore, that's the way Klal Yisrael lived for the last few thousand years, that we didn't know what was what, and therefore everyone was just makel, and that was that.
To elaborate on that, basically what I might be eating in the month of Shvat or Adar, before Pesach may really have been from last year's crop.
2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it could be
anything. So it wasn't Chadash.
Right. So Klal Yisrael for the last few thousand years, relied on the fact that we don't really know what's from last year, what's from this year. It was all mixed up, and many times there were 2-3 years, sometimes even 4 years behind on the crop they were using. So it wasn't even an issue. The best example I can give you is scotches, or things like that, which have to be aged for a minimum, I think, of 8 years before they're released. So, when someone calls and asks, "Is this Scotch Yoshon?" It's a funny question. You know what I mean? So, that's why I realize people don't really know what this means.
They don't know what they're asking.
Right, don't know what they're asking. So this is the same thing that happened in the United States. You're getting flour, generally speaking.
Meaning you might have an issue of Chametz Shavuot of a Pesach.
That could be.
But not an issue of Yoshon.
Not an issue of Yoshon, right? So it's the same thing in the United States. For sure, for many years, it was always that way, that the crop that they were using at that time was always going to be, sometimes 3, 4, maybe even more than that years behind, because they want to use that up eventually. So that was the stuff that was on the market. Now, what happened was, in some time around when Rabbi Herman started, his project, I believe, is that the United States started exporting all the old crop, and the new crop started hitting the market pretty soon, much faster. So he was alarmed, and how fast is fast? And that's when he started doing his research, and he realized that crop was coming on the market faster than anybody ever expected. And that's what I believe where his guide was born from that discovery and realization that we have to figure out what's Chodesh and what's not Chodesh. You can't just assume the old Svek Sveka applies, because it doesn't necessarily apply anymore. Got the bracha of the Gedolim at the time for his project, and he started it, and he really, again, as you mentioned in the beginning, brought Chodesh to the forefront, in Chutz La'aretz, to everybody's minds.
So now that you gave us that introduction, and we have that background and that base of understanding, what's new, let's say, today? What has been developing in this field?
So what's happened over the last number of years is that Rabbi Herman's guide was always a printed guide, based on his being Shalitza from Gedolim. He never wanted to put the information online. And the reality was information that consumers, had to get a copy of the guide for, and which people did. And his information was also what kashrus agencies kind of relied on also. Not that we couldn't figure out the information for ourselves, since we go into the factories, we go into the mills to try to understand what was what, but we didn't feel it was necessary. He was doing the research. We didn't have the impetus to expend manpower and resources on doing more than that, and that's why we always relied on his information. About 10 years ago, there was a website that came on the scene called Yoshon.com. That was started about 10 years ago by people who take Yoshon very, very seriously. And basically all they did was take Rabbi Herman's information. As I mentioned, he was hesitant to put it online. And they took the information and put it online. to make it more widely available.
Reach a wider audience,
right?
right?
Again, nowadays that's just the way things seem to be necessary to go, and it became a tremendous tailus. It made it much more widely available and much more accessible, even for us kashrus agencies. If we didn't always have the most updated copy of the guide, we can always go to Yoshon.com and see, what information Rabbi Herman was publishing, at that time. It was a big tailus for everybody. What happened about a year and a half ago, approximately, was that the kashrus agencies were approached by Rabbi Herman's family to say that they feel that the world of food technology and science has gotten very, very big. There's so many companies now, so many mills, so many companies that are producing wheat grain-based products. So Rabbi Herman's family approached the kashrus agencies and said that the gathering of information is becoming more and more complicated for them. They don't have the resources to do it to the extent that they feel they need to maintain their father's mahalach. And can the kashrus agencies, are they willing to help out? And we said, of course. And I emphasize very strongly, we, the kashrus agencies, because it's no one particular agency, as much as I do work for the Star K, and we do have a guide that we ourselves put out, which was always based either on his information until now, and now we'll discuss where we get our information from. But it's a joint project of all the kashrus agencies that are relevant, who are giving certifications on these products, because we have mashgichim who are certifying plants, or going into plants, and can actually figure out and find out Yoshon information, actual Yoshon information, real cutoff dates, without relying on estimates or things like that. We were able to get actual real information. They would ask if we would be willing to get involved in publishing or disseminating Yoshon information, that from companies nowadays. So we said, of course. And we formed a committee of all the different agencies to work on this and basically gather information from all the mashgichim from all the different companies, starting with the mills and then getting to products. Now, that's an important piece of information there, and the reason is the following thing, is that the way it's always been thought, or the way it's always, shouldn't say the way it's always been thought, the way it's always been published is that we get one cutoff date for, let's say, wheat, and that applies to any wheat-based product, whether it's a flour, whether it's a cookie, whether it's a cookie crumb, and any cereal, anything. Everyone's going with the same date. The reality is that that's not what's going on in reality, because obviously wheat first goes to a mill, it gets milled into flour, and then has to get transported to the company that makes the cookie, and then it gets put onto the market. So there's a number of weeks, if not months, in between. So the question was, how much time goes on in between? So, Rabbi Herman obviously was never able to, he didn't have access to the companies to find out how much that lag time is. So he went with one cutoff date for everything. But now
that really ended up being l'chumra?
That ended up being tremendously l'chumra,
right?
Which again is a safe bet,
it's safe
right?
Bet,
you know, if you wanted to bet on it, that was definitely a safe bet to go with. But the reality is that you certainly can make the dates much later, because the reality is, from the time the cookie company gets their flour from the mill, right? If, let's say, the mill gets their flour in on August 1st, right? Assuming they mill that day. By the time it gets to the cookie company, it's probably at least 2 weeks later.
And then there's manufacturing time.
And manufacturing time. So they're not waiting to get their flour before they start making their cookies. Right? They have flour previously in stock. So the question was, how much time is all that? So obviously the kashrus agencies have access to that information as much as possible to find out from their mashgichim. Number one, you talk to the mill and you find out, first of all, when actually are you getting chadash in? So that was the first thing. So we created a list of when you're actually getting chadash in, each mill getting chadash. And we have a list of mills. It's not so relevant for consumers, because consumers generally, are not, we're talking about commercial mills.
Right.
The ones that produce retail flour, we have a list for, but the commercial mills, which is many, many, many mills, we have a list of when they actually got the first chadash flour in for the season, and it varies tremendously. We have some mills that got in, I think the earliest date this year was August 7th. But that was a mill that wasn't relevant to anything retail. It was only a commercial mill. And then there are some mills that haven't yet even gotten it in.
Really?
And we're in December.
We're
in January already. We're in January already.
Wow.
They haven't even got it in yet. Because it sits in the warehouses. They're not ready for it yet. Their shelves are still full from last year. Whatever it is. So it varies that much. And then you have, after it's from the mill, when do they start shipping it out to companies? So if you have a company that orders flour, right, when are they going to be getting from that new shipment? So at each step, you're able to speak to the mashgiach in the mill. When did the mill get the chadashin? You speak to the mashgiach in the cookie factory. When did you get the new shipment of flour in after this date? So the way we were doing it now is that we the list that we have for the mills is that the first date that the mill got chadashin, that's the last date. That's a good date. The day they're actually getting it in, and the next day, all bets are off. We can't guarantee that this flour anymore, this mill anymore, is going to be 100% Yoshon. And then the mashgiach and the cookie company will say, okay, where are you getting your flour from? Now, he might know, he says, I'm getting it from this and this mill. Fine, if you're getting it from this and this mill, after the cutoff date for that mill, when's the first shipment of flour that you got? 3 weeks later, that's the cutoff date for the cookies. Right. So you have a different cutoff date for the mills and a different cutoff date for the cookies. Now, sometimes the mashgiach will say, I don't know, they get from 35 different mills. Too complicated. And the reality is that he's busy. He wants to make sure that
taking care
of the kashrus, right? He doesn't necessarily have to spend time tracking down the flour.
Right.
Fine. So that's respectable enough. The question is that if they don't know then, but we're still going to estimate or go with how often do you get shipments of flour in? So you're able to ascertain that after this and this date, the earliest mill, whatever date that was, that's now the cutoff date for places that we don't know when they're getting new flour in.
Right. But basically, what you're doing is you're really buying yourself time that you previously didn't have. Whereas in the past, if we knew some date in August was when the harvest took place, that was it for that season.
Right.
Whereas over here, if we know for whatever reason that it takes X amount of time and then there's production time, you could buy yourself weeks or months, and you're thus shortening what we would call the Chadash season.
Correct. So what's happened this year is that, and let's clarify and pull together everything that we just said, is that now we have this between the Starkey Quick Guide that we have on our website and the information that the agencies are now giving to Yoshon.com, we have is that a list of dates for products that are very different from each other, meaning there's not necessarily one cutoff date that now goes through all these guides. Everything is different, and everything is based on actual dates that we get from the mashgichim and the plants. Now, that is very different than the way Rabbi Herman's guide has traditionally been run. Where you have, like you said, one cutoff date, and that's where everything goes. Now you have different dates for products as opposed as you do for mills. And the benefit of that is that the increased availability of Yoshon products exponentially because of that. It's been tremendous. And another example is that once we dug into this deeper, we realized that oats was always assumed to be one of the earlier grains that came on the market. But once we dug into it more, paying attention to Yoshon, we realized that the oats that are used in the United States for food-grade oats are almost exclusively from Canada. The oats grown in the United States are almost all animal grade. And the Canadian oats come into the market much, much later just because of the weather. Right? So oats now is actually one of the later items.
Interesting. It was always from the earlier ones. You're saying now with this piece of information, it changes.
It changes everything. Right? So for this year, it kind of caused confusion when we started putting out this information because people were used to the guide to Chodesh, which still did come out with their edition at the beginning of the season, and their dates are much earlier than our dates.
Right.
Our dates, I mean, again, the Starkey Guide or the Yoshon.com dates, but what we explain to people is that our dates are based on actual information from the plants, knowing exactly when they're getting Chodesh in, as opposed to just an estimate based on the crop harvest.
Very interesting. So it is somewhat a game changer in the Yoshon world. I would say especially this conversation is taking place during an Ibriyar, when the Chadash/Yoshon season is longer because there's an extra month before Pesach. So this could actually be significantly helpful to people, just like you said, it increases availability.
Definitely increases availability of Yoshon, and it's made companies, very, very happy to know that we have actual dates, not based on estimates. Right. Because also you have to keep in mind, bakeries and industrial companies pay a premium for Yoshon flour. Right. Whether it's from distributors or from the mill themselves, because obviously the company's standpoint, it's like somebody wants this particular item, charge more money for it, right? So this is saved people a lot of money and has made Yoshon availability exponentially higher.
Now I've heard also about an app that there's some kind of app that you could actually scan items in the supermarket and it'll pop up the Yoshon status. Right. Is that a Starkey project?
That is not a Starkey project. Okay. That is actually a part of Yoshon.com. They developed their website, which is a very searchable website, and an app that goes with their website. And and they do it, by the way. They are doing this L'Shem Shemaim. They do not make any money. They charge, I think, $3.99 for the app just to cover the costs for developing it. But they do this whole thing L'Shem Shemaim. You can scan a product UPC symbol, UPC code with this app, and it will give you the Yoshon information for it.
That's also a game changer.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's,
I could tell you how many times I've been in the supermarket over the years, and I remember I didn't have a guide. I'm calling my mother. Could you look up?
Right, exactly.
Could you look up the dates?
Right.
But over here, if you have an app,
you have an app.
It's
a phenomenal piece of technology. I give it to all my shlichim to download it. And to utilize Yoshon.com as much as possible, also because it's updated in real time. Anytime information, and the truth is, this is also something that I think this is important for consumers to know, and that is that everyone gets impatient. Come Rosh Chodesh Elul, when's the Yoshon information coming out? When's the Yoshon information coming out? Rosh Hashanah, the weeks before Rosh Hashanah. Besides all the regular styles before Yontiv, it's like Yoshon. What's going on? The reality is that it's very early in the season still. Even Rosh Hashanah is late. It's very early in the season to know when the companies are getting in Yoshon. A lot of times they themselves don't know. If what we discussed before is that the product gets harvested and then gets transported to companies, that's all taking place during El around end of the summer. That's when it's all taking place. So companies a lot of times don't know. Said the truck was supposed to come in yesterday. Now they say it's not coming till next week. They don't know.
They don't have it.
They really don't know. So what people have to recognize is that the information comes in over periods of time. It's not like all of a sudden one day, boom, you have all the Yoshon information. So what we could do is we could just say, okay, you know what? We're going to give one date l'chumra, which is part of what Rabbi Herman's cheshbon was in doing that. But the reality is that then it will change. And it will change later and later and later and later.
Right.
And many things are going to constantly change, until, November, right? Things are constantly being updated. And that's why, it is helpful to have a website, because things are updated in real time as the information comes in.
So just to end this conversation, if someone wants to stay on top of Chodesh and Yoshon information, what are their options? Their options are Yoshon.com.
Yoshon.com is really the best resource that we have. The Starcade publishes what we call our quick guide, again, but it's just really the most commonly available products. It's honestly, as I said before.
Where is that available?
That's available on the Starcade website.
Okay.
It's just like a kitzer of what's available in Yoshon.com and / what Rabbi Herman's guide has been until now. The Herman family did indicate that they're not planning on continuing the guide. Because we've been in touch with them constantly about kind of taking over this and putting out this information through Yoshon.com, both as an online and printed guide. So that's really where consumers' best resource is going to be.
Okay, Rabbi Tellner, thank you for being here. Thank you for this fascinating discussion, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you very much.